welcome back. I know it's going to be kind of interesting. We got spring maybe creeping around the door. Just looking at the forecast, it looks like we might reach the fields soon. One thing I do want to kind of go over, and I'd love to do this in a field. Don't get me wrong. It really sucks I'm doing this in my office, but the fields are so wet right now. It's almost impossible to show you what I need to show you. So let's talk about vertical tillage or tillage in a wet spring. So we're going to be wet more than likely when we start reaching the field. So it's not going to be wet on top, obviously, but we're going to be talking about ground conditions. So when we're looking at a field and we want to check it out to see if we can plant it, we typically will just dig in that top 2 inches here, and we'll check this, because obviously that's our seed bed. But what we really need to be doing is looking at our depth of tillage. So if we're running a field cultivator or finisher, we need to be going down to maybe 4 to 5 inches. And this is what you want to check. We want to take this soil and just dig down, grab it, and if you can make a ball out of it really easily, that's a problem. I mean, honestly, it's going to be probably wet for a while. So yeah, it's going to make a ball. You're going to be able to stick that soil in between your thumb and your finger and kind of run a ribbon on it. Another test that I've seen and I've used, and it seems to work, is if you can ball it up, you drop it from about shoulder high and it still stays together. There's nothing breaks off of it. It's definitely too wet for tillage. So the other thing we got to remember, I mean, obviously you're going to hit this with your field cultivator finisher. So a lot of the guys want to run, maybe we'll shallow it up to 3 inches, maybe we'll go up to here. And so at that point, we're putting the seed at 2, at least we should be. And we got this layer here, at 3 inches, and it gets, we'll just say this is like impenetrable, unless it stays wet. But knowing most of our soils around here, it seems to get really dry like that. Last year it was like 80 degrees, and all of a sudden within 3 days everything was just bone dry. So we're going to put a restrictive layer in there, and I've seen this already this year. We had some work ground before planting this year, and we kept shallowing up the field cultivator, and literally when I was trying to pull back the soil to try to find some seed, and it was still fairly wet, I basically put my trowel in, went down to where I hit a restriction at all, and I pulled back, and it's just a solid sheet, like right at 3 inches. So yeah, it's going to be a problem. The other thing is too, we're running field cultivators, finishers, we're going to start pulling up chunks of this stuff, and it's going to be lumpy. It's going to be hard to plant into. You're going to maybe want to hit it twice, which make it worse, but it's probably going to break up some of the clumps, but you're going to make the compaction way worse. So the one thing we can do to maybe kind of alleviate some of this issues is going to vertical tillage. So vertical tillage, we can set that vertical tillage depth at pretty much right at 2 inches. So if we can set our vertical tillage at 2 inches, we're playing at 2 inches, you're basically planting seeds right into that layer. And when the roots come out, their roots are going to come out right below that layer. So you're going to end up with less compaction to deal with for that seed. Because if you had a layer at 5 inches, it hits that, and then they want to grow this way until we get a rain, and eventually maybe they'll go down a little bit. But for the most part, vertical tillage is going to be a fairly decent option. The thing guys are going to have to remember is you want to be right at that planting depth or slightly above it. So maybe if you're going in at 1 3/4 inches or 2 inches, if you can put the seed in right below that, that's going to be that's what you want to do. You want to be just below or right at your vertical tillage depth. The only thing with vertical till is, obviously some vertical tillage tools are not the same. So we're going to deal with Landau's typically the one. The older deer tools, I haven't seen much of the new ones, but the older ones definitely have more concave discs, so they're our typical disc design where it's at an angle and then they shear straight across. It's basically a disc, but they call it a vertical till because the angle is not as aggressive. love to have is something that doesn't have that conical shape as much. You know, Case IH makes one that's fairly decent. That's kind of it's not the typical, you know, we're not getting the huge concave on the discs. Another one I really like, and the one we have, is a cross accelerator, where they're basically the same discs, but then they're notch discs. This really sucks. It's terrible. I'm not good at art. So I really like the cross accelerators. Anything I can get a fairly small degree of angle. So our cross only goes up to 5 degrees. I think the case is like 10 to 13. Great Plains makes one. Salford just is, they're a decent tool, but the problem is the depth, or the distance between the gangs is great enough that, yeah, you get some wavy action in here, but in between it doesn't quite do as good of a job. So I've never really liked the Salfords too much, unless you're trying to size some residue up and do some other things. But anyway, the whole thing is, we want to go with the least amount of angle we possibly can, so we're not creating any kind of smear layer in here. The other thing is too, I mean, we're going to create some, but not as much as like a field cultivator with sweeps. The other thing you're going to have to take into account too is your wheel tracks. So if we're doing, we're working at stuff ahead of planting, you know, compaction's greatest time of the year, and the greatest point for compaction is always going to be in spring, and it's going to be when soils are not saturated, but when they're at basically at holding capacity, or a little bit below holding capacity. So yeah, it is saturated. So when we're out there and we're making ribbons and stuff at 3-4 inches, and we're going to drive through there, you know, you're going to see that compaction layer come in everywhere we put a wheel track in, and it's going to go down. In some cases, depending on your tractors, if it's fluid fill tires or whatever you're going to go out with, this could be 12 inches deep. And yeah, you can get it out next fall, but we're not going to get it out this spring. And you're going to plant a seed into it. It's going to hit this, and it's basically just going to try to go around it. And you know, if your tires are 30 inches wide, it takes a while for that to happen. So we've done this where I've seen with drone footage, these tire tracks all the way across the field, we can make it out. And that was on a drier year than this year, so it's going to be very, very evident. So you're going to be kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But if it were me, and I was doing tillage this spring, I would definitely consider vertical tillage over more of our conventional tillage approach. It's just something that you should keep in mind. The other thing is, we're going to really want to run really low down pressure on planters, as low as you possibly can, to keep a fairly decent amount of ground contact. And you're going to want to make sure we're not going overboard. So for guys with springs, it's going to be really hard to figure out, but you're going to have to play with it and dig. I've already seen a couple of times this year where we had sidewall compaction. What I like to do to find out if I'm doing sidewall compaction is I'll dig the trench out, and then I'll take my knife, or I usually have a seed finder. Let me see if I got it. I'll take my seed finder, and I'll actually take it at the bottom of the trench and then just grab it underneath and push up. And if there's a lot of resistance and you have big clumps coming up, this usually means we have lots of sidewall compaction. So that's another thing to watch for. So we're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to deal with tire tracks. We're going to have to deal with troubles closing the trench. I've had it a bunch of times where guys are going really heavy pressure because they can't close it unless they get more pressure on it. And then at the same time, they're making a big, you know, when you actually look down the trench, they're basically making a big V in here of soil, and I can actually pull that whole thing right out. So that also is bad at the same time, because your corn's going to want to hit this, and it's going to want to grow this way unless it's wet. So you'll end up with corn coming out of the side of the trench. And sometimes this will delay it maybe a day or two, 1 to 2 days. And for us, we want to be all within that first 12 hours. And this is 24 to 48. So we could lose a significant chunk of yield doing that as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. Yeah, it's going to be one of those springs, and you're going to have to adjust for settings. I mean, there's no field that's going to be 100% fully fit, and I've realized that. I farmed in Ixonia for a few years now. You know, or at least I haven't farmed, but I've been around Ixonia for a long time. I've worked with heavy clays, and we've never, outside of 2012 and I think 2015, never pulled into a field that was 100% fully ready to go. So you're just going to have to be making settings on the fly and trying to kind of figure this stuff out on your own. But I think the biggest thing is making sure you're not creating too much compaction. You know, and make sure you're closing the trench, but not putting too much pressure on it. And as Ken Ferry says, we're gonna have to make the planter dance a little bit, trying to make sure you get the right amount of down pressure, but not too much. It's gonna be really hard. It's gonna be a lot of more work, but for the most part, that's what I'm gonna be talking to a lot of guys about probably today and tomorrow. Trying to figure out how we're gonna accomplish tillage, and you know, and a lot of people said, well, why don't we just no-till? The problem is going to be there's a lot of clay ground that it's really difficult to no-till into. I had a couple people that were pretty staunch no-tillers that have a cross accelerator that they hit every piece of corn ground with now. So it's gotten to that point that tillage is kind of something we need to do. Along with that, we got a lot of ruts left over from last year. There's some spots in our territory that in our fields, we've got ruts that are 3-4 feet deep, and not necessarily ruts, I'll say washouts. We had a couple 10-inch rainfalls last year, and I mean 10 inches within a few hours, and we got washouts everywhere. We've got no fall tillage done. It was just so wet last fall, so we're really kind of going to be in a pickle. So anyway, that's my thing on planters and tillage for the day, but this is kind of something important to get out before we get going. Really make sure you're digging down to your depth of tillage and testing that soil. Like I said, if you can make a ball out of it really easy, you can run a ribbon with it between your finger, you know, just keep pushing it out. If you can get that ribbon 2-3 inches long, it's probably too wet for tillage. If you can drop it from shoulder height and it still sticks together and just goes splat, it's probably too wet. So just keep in mind ground conditions, you know, and your depth of tillage in relation to where you're planting. That's going to be the biggest thing. When we figured this kind of out a few years ago with vertical tillage, we've had nothing but success in this kind of conditions, outside of a bunch of prevent plant and some replant last year, but that was mostly because of weather, not necessarily because of our tillage and stuff. But just keep this stuff in mind. Working ground to try to dry it out. It's going to happen. You hate to see it. If you're going to do something like that, try doing vertical tillage, but don't hit it when it's so wet. You're just going to make a big smear layer. You're going to see your wheel tracks all year. Yeah, I mean, you could lose 50 bushels at planting time, and you wouldn't. I mean, it just come right out the top, and you could wait 2 days, and I don't know. We just have a lot of decisions to make in the next couple weeks, but I'm checking it, still May 10th, so we still got a good 3 weeks in our area to get corn in. That's until our late plant dates, so we've got plenty of time. Time is not exactly of the essence, but pretty soon it's going to start getting to that point. So anyway, hopefully I'll see you next time. Hopefully it's in a tractor or in a field somewhere, so I'll catch you later.